Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Pleased to be joined this week by Mike DeCourcy of the Sporting News and the Big Ten Network. And Mike, obviously, it's been quite a while since our last episode of Podcast on the Brink. We've been on a bit of a summer break. A lot has happened. Most notably in college sports, we've had some movement. Two new members of the Big Ten coming in 2024. Did you ever think we would be talking about Big Ten 2024 with UCLA and USC?
Yeah, I did not see that coming. I will acknowledge that there had been some conversation. I mean, I'm going to go back like probably 15 years ago at least, and talk about how I wrote. And this is long before I was associated with the Big Ten Network or anything like that. I wrote that Big Ten should go after Texas. I thought that would be a great idea. And obviously that would have a geographical disconnect from any other Big Ten members. But I just thought they fit the league, that they could expand the weight of it. That I thought they fit it from, that whole academic standpoint that's very important to the Big Ten members. I thought that they fit right in there, that the weight of their basketball programs and football programs. And don't forget at that time, I mean, that's during the time when Mac Brown was coach and Rick Barnes had great teams at Texas as well in basketball. And I believe their women's basketball was still on near the top, and everything seemed to be in order for them to do that. And that's not something that the Big Ten ever decided to do, or maybe they did and Texas wasn't interested. I don't know. I've never asked. I should ask Jim Delaney about that sometime, whether they ever seriously considered that. So the concept isn't that foreign to me, but by the time we got to here, I hadn't really given it much thought that would be something that would be likely to happen. But you can see the value in it, especially at a time when the Big Ten Conference is in television negotiations for its next contract, its next multimedia contract, its next multi-sport contract, that adding two historically great teams, one in football and one in men's basketball, and obviously they've both been great in numerous other sports as well, adding them in the nation's number 2 media market, you can't miss with that. So I understand why it happened now. It's just not something that I've given much thought to in the last year or so.
What is the end game, I guess, in your mind for all of this? Because it seems like we've had expansion kind of on a rolling basis now for quite a while. I mean, going back to when the Big Ten grabbed Penn State, and then the Big Ten grabs Nebraska, and then they grab Rutgers and Maryland, and now UCLA and USC. And there's been a lot of talk that there could be 2 super conferences, 20 teams, things like that. I don't know how that makes a lot of sense for football scheduling. How can you have a 20 team conference when you're only playing 9 or 10 games? How is that gonna work? But I digress. We know this is all driven by football, first and foremost, but I'm just curious where you kind of see this ending up. I mean, it's maybe an impossible question to answer, but I mean, do you feel like this is the Big Ten's kind of settled for now, or are there 2 more teams that obviously there's been talk about Notre Dame, there's other schools out there, but is this something that we're going to have to continue to watch in the years to come, or do you think we get maybe resolution here in the next couple of years as to where a settling point for all this could be?
Alex, one of the things that the media, or I shouldn't say the media, I mean, I hate when people do that, so I should do it. But one of the things that particular people in the media do, individuals will do, is try to assert symmetry and balance to things that aren't necessarily predisposed to that. As a decade ago, when things were moving around, the inevitability was 4 16-team super conferences. And my position always was, you're never going to get them all to sit down and divide it up that way. That's not how any of this has ever worked. Going back to Penn State's entry into the Big Ten, no one sat down and said, okay, you get them, we get them, we'll all head up with, no one's done that. So I don't look at this and say there are going to be 2 super conferences or how many teams they're going to have. They're going to be conferences that are super rich. You know what, Alex? There were two conferences that were super rich 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's gotten progressively wealthier for them over the last several years. I think the disparity is going to grow this time. It already has. If you look at what the SEC signed for a year and a half ago or so, and what the terrific media reporters like John Orand have been projecting, it was going to grow significantly for the Big Ten even before they made this move. And the gap was going to be vast between them and the other leagues. But what does that mean? Well, it means that they can order lunch without having to check whether there's enough money in the budget. Yes, definitely. But unless there is a world in which the teams are forced, and I think it will take force, to pay the players directly as employees. And what could force it? One, governmental action, and that's basically what brought about ultimately the name, image, and likeness deal. California, various other states followed. All of a sudden, you really don't have any choice. California has discussed a bill to make paying athletes required in California, and then whether or not others would follow, who knows? But that bill also hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, right now it's just sort of sitting there with very little support. So unless that happens, that money difference hasn't really materially impacted the competition. I mean, Clemson has been making less than Alabama in terms of media rights. It's been making less by about a third or so for the last 10 years, let's say. The ACC has never been in the SEC's, in that period, in the SEC's ballpark financially. But Clemson has been highly competitive with the best SEC teams, won a championship, played in the final at least one other time, maybe twice. I don't know those stats as well as I do the NCAA, but they've been really competitive. So it's a little harder. You got to raise a little more money. You got to maybe cut something a little fat out of your budget, but you can do it. And I think that's what's going to continue to happen as long as the players aren't paid employees. I don't want to say professional because now they kind of are, but paid employees, as long as that happens. And so I think that, they can complain about it and not be happy about it, but that's their reality. I mean, the ACC signed a 13-year grant of rights, or 14 years from now, I believe, grant of rights, 2036. They have a contract that runs with ESPN for the ACC network and various other associated media rights for until 2036. So I saw a report a week ago, I think it was a week ago, from the Swim Swam, which is a terrific site for swimming news if you're into that stuff. But they were saying that the ACC wants to void that deal. Well, Alex, if somebody's going to give me a Cadillac for $30,000, I'm not going to say, no, I want to pay the full 60. I mean, that's not what I'm going to do. And right now, that's kind of what you have in the state with the ACC. They have those teams locked up at a contract that is 40, 50 cents on the dollar to what's being paid in the SEC. Now, the ACC may be a more valuable property, but the ACC is not bad. A lot of people are watching. So ESPN's not going to get out of that deal in any big hurry.
One thing I've thought about a lot, and obviously I cover only Indiana basketball, but listeners of the show and just Big Ten fans in general, I think this is just an interesting question, and you may not know the answer to this, but something I've thought about a lot. What long-term is going to keep these schools with maybe less competitive football programs aligned with a conference like the SEC? For example, let's say Vanderbilt. These schools are splitting the pie evenly. I guess that's how most of the deals work with the TV money. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Alabama is obviously a much bigger deal to the SEC in football than Vanderbilt. what's going to stop long term a school like Alabama saying we're worth this in terms of a TV deal, and Vanderbilt, you're worth this. We don't, we want to give you less money, or we don't want you as a part of this anymore. It's something I've thought about with IU football, because obviously the basketball property at Indiana is far more valuable to the athletic department. Maybe not overall, just in football, I'm sure brings in its grand share revenue, but basketball is the prestige program. So I'm just kind of curious how you see all that working out and how these leagues are going to stick together, because it's obviously this is all about money. And so I'm just curious how what's going to stop these larger name schools that one day saying, we don't really want to split money with a Vanderbilt football or Northwestern or Indiana.
Well, I think first, Alex, I think there's an understanding that there's a value in the brand. And so if you are Alabama, you could probably throw a little muscle around and get a few more dollars, a bigger share. That's happened before in various leagues, and Clemson could probably do that now in the ACC if they wanted to try. But there's a value in the brand, and so if you want to say we can go out and do our best, we can do better on our own. I mean, Alabama could do that. I mean, Notre Dame's been doing it for its entire existence, going back, 125 years or so. So they could do that, but they lose the value of the brand. And it's the same, it's the same. I extrapolate that to the NCAA tournament as well. And there's a lot of conversation about, is all of this going to kill the NCAA tournament? And Jeff Goodman from Field of 68, I believe he tweeted about 10 days ago that his sources are telling him that Greg Sankey is kind of agitating for that. And now that was refuted by others, but that was what he reported. But none of that is from on the record sources, and I haven't seen Greg comment on it. But there is a very vast understanding among principals who are involved in that tournament, in the leagues that feed that tournament. There's an understanding that, wait a second, we're talking about $1 billion in television revenue for 3 weeks of hoops. 3 weeks. That's it. And everything else you get, create or whatever. But for 3 weeks, we get $1 billion. There's just no way they can duplicate. And I don't mean duplicate it like dollar for dollar, but I mean per capita. I mean, they're not reaching that. The NCAA tournament is an extraordinary value for the participants in terms of television revenue. So it's sort of the same concept. You can go off and create your own super conference basketball tournament, and some people will watch, but others will abandon it because you've given up on the thing that they love. And in the end, it probably won't be worth as much per capita. And it's a gamble to find out. So I think that it's the same thing with the SEC or any other conference. You can try to bargain for more money, but if you try to take your enterprise out of the SEC, you're going to lose popularity and probably lose revenue, and it won't be a smart business move.
Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, all this is driven by football, but we're basketball guys, and so that's what we like to talk about here on the show. What do you see the long-term impact of all of this realignment being on the Big Ten in general, the conference having UCLA and USC obviously makes the conference stronger. But as these conferences start to get bigger and bigger, what's the impact to what the Big Ten looks like during conference play? And ultimately, as you touched on a little bit, the NCAA tournament, do you think this is going to hurt the smaller leagues in terms of having a seat at the table? I mean, obviously, you mentioned the discussion of that already in place. But I agree with you. I think the best thing the tournament is to kind of keep the relative smaller teams in there. I mean, the St. Peter's runners cheering it for fans of Kentucky and Purdue and everybody else. So a great story to follow. A lot of fun to watch stuff. So I guess UCLA and USC, how does that change the Big Ten from a basketball perspective and these super conferences? What if you want to call that on, what impact does that have in general as a college basketball long term?
Well, I think first with the Big Ten, you look at it now, it's a 16-team league. when the two Southern California schools arrived. I think we've had a 16-team league in the WAC, I believe, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we had it obviously with the Big East through the middle 2000s and early 2010s. And it makes it really challenging, really competitive. The Big East in 2011 got 11 of its teams into the tournament. And it's, I believe it's ninth place team UConn wound up winning the NCAA championship, which shows how it really deepens the league to add those two schools. They obviously have great recruiting bases. They have terrific coaches in Andy Enfield and Mick Cronin. They have a great history in UCLA and a very good one with USC in the sport. So it's going to be very challenging. It's going to make it a harder job for the coaches to succeed, to maintain their jobs. It's going to be very difficult, but they're also going to be able to sell what I think one could say will be the best college basketball conference, most likely, and possibly, if things go right, the most difficult conference ever anybody's played in. I mean, in 2020, 21, and 22, I don't think any league's ever been as deep as the Big Ten was. One of the things that I always differentiated that era Big Ten from the 2011 Big East was one of the reasons why the 2011 Big East was so strong was in terms of putting out NCAA tournament bids and such, was that they had 4 or 5 teams at the bottom that basically couldn't beat anybody except each other. If you go back and look at the numbers, they have 1 team, 2 teams that could get any wins against teams that were in the tournament division, so to speak. I think that made it, really hard for those bottom teams to be relevant. And so where does that leave you? And that becomes a problem now for the teams that play to the bottom of this league. One of the things that I really liked that the Big East did then, and that I would encourage the Big Ten to consider, was they had tiered scheduling. They looked at the teams, they said, okay, these are the teams we project to be the best 5. So you're going to play each other twice. And these are the teams that are going to be the next 5. So you're going to play each other twice, and all the way down. And so the bottom teams were playing each other more often. So they actually had the experience of winning a game here or there, as opposed to everybody down at that end going 0-16 or 0-18 or whatever it would be. I think it's a pretty smart approach, and it didn't really affect the ability of the teams at the upper end to compete for conference championships. It basically it got you more quality wins. If you were as great as all that, you probably, you were going to be first, second, third, or fourth in the conference. You never really saw the impact that much of that tiered scheduling on teams' ability to compete at the level that they were assigned. I think that UConn team struggled that year. They finished 500 in the league, but a lot of that was just sort of trying to find their way. And then they ultimately figured it out in the Big East tournament and went on to win the NCAA. So I think it deepens the league. It makes it harder to compete in. It's a little bit harder to travel, but Alex, let me tell you, every fan should look and like, do we get to play UCLA this year? Because I get to go, I can go to Poly for the first time in my life or whatever. I said this on BTN the night of the announcement that it's an experience, especially for us, we who live in the Midwest, to be able to go out to Southern California in January is pretty amazing. I've made that trip at least a half dozen times, once when I was covering the Pitt, and then 4 or 5 times, maybe more when I was, doing the national thing for Sporting News. And it never disappointed. It just was always an incredible weekend.
Next season's Big Ten race is something we're all already looking forward to. And as I mentioned to you before I hit record, I always do my off-season Big Ten power rankings. For the last several years, I've had Indiana anywhere from 7, 8, 9 in the league. this year I've kept track of all the rosters and kind of gone through everything, looked at Bart Torvik's ratings, looked at preseason top 25s, tried to be as objective as possible. And I've come to the conclusion that right now I've got Indiana as my top team in the Big Ten. I don't feel strongly about it, but just looking at all the rosters and who's coming back, that's where I landed. What are your thoughts on the Big Ten as a league next season and where Indiana may fit in, at least entering the season?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly where I had Indiana right after the tournament was over. I do a ranking at that point because it's something that people enjoy. And it's harder now than it ever was because of the transfer portal and all that. And I had at that point, I thought that Michigan was a clear-cut choice to be number one. But then Caleb Houston and Moussa Diabate decided to stay in the draft. I think was a mistake. I think they cost themselves money. I thought Michigan State had a chance to be really good, but they also lost an essential player. And so when you get down to it, who is left and who has left, either because it was the obviously smart thing to do, like a Johnny Davis or a Keegan Murray, or because they got in too big a hurry, like the guys at Michigan or Michigan State. I think that the only other arguments one could make against IU are Illinois because of the transfer portal being good to them, so to speak, and possibly Purdue because the culture's still the culture. They still have good players. You know, they still have Edey and a really good group of young players around him. I don't think he can make an argument for anybody else to try to win this league. I think there are going to be teams that are going to find a way to do well. Maybe Ohio State bounces back a little bit as they're healthier. They were fine last year, but they weren't what they could have been if they'd have been healthy. But I don't think there's enough at Michigan State. I don't think there's enough now at Michigan. And so I those are the schools that I look at and think they have a chance to win this league. I don't think it will be as powerful as it's been the past 3 years because of those players that decided to go to the league. If they had not, if they were back this year, I think we would have been looking at a really rich Big Ten. I think it's still going to be very competitive and entertaining, but I don't think it's going to be as deep and powerful as it was the last 3 years. Of course, the oddity of that, Alex, is that even with that depth and power, they did not do well in the NCAA. So maybe you come back this year and you're not as deep and strong, and maybe that helps the teams. I wrote about this after the meltdown in 2021, that I think being in that deep a league is bad for you if you want to do well in the NCAAs. Historically, that Big East that I talked about in 2011, they had 2 teams make the Sweet 16 out of 11. And the only reason, one of the reasons that happened was because each of them, because there were so many of them, each of them played another Big East tournament, another Big East team in the second round. So it was a guarantee that somebody had to make the Sweet 16. So it might help the Hoosiers. It might help Illinois, Purdue to maybe have the league not be the unbelievable grind it's been over the last 3 years.
Is there any worry when you look at just kind of what Indiana did as a team last year? I mean, I think we all remember that run that they had at the end of the season through the Big Ten tournament, making the tournament. They beat Wyoming in the first 4, then they have to go play in St. Mary's 2 days later. You know, it seems to me that people are obviously hyper focused on that and the fact that everybody's coming back, and maybe not focused on the fact that up until that 17-point comeback in the second half against Michigan, this was a very average team. So I'm not sure exactly what you can point to in terms of their actual performance outside of that little run to say they deserve to be the Big Ten favorite. Is it just the fact that you've got a great player in Trace Jackson Davis coming back, or is there something else that you see that makes you feel like they're one of the favorites to win the league?
Well, a couple of things. Remember that old joke, like it's like in Bugs Bunny cartoons, kind of like where there's this big line of maybe soldiers, and they say, we need a volunteer for this really dangerous mission, and everybody takes one step back. It's kind of a little bit there's a little bit of an element of that. That's part of why they stand where they stand. I think there's also the recruitment of really significant talents that others wanted, like Jalen Hood, Schifino, and Malik Renault. I mean, those guys are the kinds of players that people say are expected to lift you up. You have the possibility of players improving, and I mean, Trace coming back. If Trace comes back and is the same player he was the last 2 years, he's still the best player in the Big Ten. But if he came back to be the same player he was the last 2 years, then he's wasting his time in basketball wise, vis-a-vis the NBA. I mean, it's obviously great to be at IU and great to play for the Hoosiers and all that. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think a player like Trace, who has a pro future, came back to be the same guy. I think he came back to get better. And I have very little doubt he's out there working as we speak, trying to get better. So if he gets better, he's not just the best player in the Big Ten. He's one of the best players in the country, and he's a game changer. And I think that makes a difference. Going from a second team / third team All-American over the last 2 years, that's a really good player. But when you're a first teamer, which he has every ability to do, that wins games, that wins tough games, that changes teams. So I think that's what he's going to be this year. The concern that I have is not necessarily what they were a year ago, but what they'll be this year. And that is, is there a shooter here? Are there two shooters? Guys that you can rely upon to go out and make you buckets, to open up defense, to make it easier for Trace to be good, to make it easier for Race to have space around the basket and all the improvement he made a year ago, even while people were still jamming the lane because nobody was making shots and drawing the defense out. Like Miller Kopp, I just have to think that now a year in the system and a year of understanding what it's like to play in games where winning, everybody wants to win. But when you were at Northwestern, after a certain point, when he was there, they weren't playing those kinds of high pressure games in late February and March. Well, now he's gone through it. Maybe he can deal with it and be an impactful player. I look at a guy like Tamar Bates, who I think has a really nice stroke and can become a great shooter. Again, does he work at it? Is he working now while we're talking to try to become better? Trey Galloway was hurt so much last year, and that really impacted the ability of the team to develop and to make full use of the special qualities that he brings. So everything when you're looking at a season is predicated on full health, how a team will develop. And inevitably some guys get hurt. It's a question of what the injury is going to be and how long they're out. So you hope that doesn't impact you too much. You obviously need that kind of health to get to the finish line where you want to be. But if you have a reasonable amount of health and a reasonable amount of improvement this summer, I really think that there's no question that this team should be one of the top three in the conference.
One name we haven't mentioned yet is Xavier Johnson, and he was a catalyst, obviously, in that late season run. He's back for another year. He's another guy who's older, but at times I've kind of compared him to Troy Williams when he was in Indiana. There was always a joke among Indiana fans. There was good Troy and there was bad Troy. When good Troy was on, he could take over a game. When bad Troy showed up, you never know what could happen. And Xavier Johnson had stretches of play last season. I can remember a very early season game when they were playing at Wisconsin. I don't remember if you remember this game. They had a huge lead. They blew it in the second half. Johnny Davis took over, and Mike Woodson sent Xavier Johnson out to the media. It was almost like he was throwing him to the wolves. Maybe based on his NBA background is, you take responsibility for the loss. And Xavier Johnson came out and basically apologized for how he played in the second half. He didn't play very well. That was an example of, him kind of bringing the team down to an extent and not being the leader. And then late in the season, we saw him play at a level that he looked like an all Big Ten guard there in the Big Ten tournament and at times late in the season. What what is reasonable to expect from a guy like Xavier Johnson, who's now very seasoned in terms of his college basketball career? And can you win at a high level with a point guard that you may not know what you're getting from that guy on a night in, night out basis?
Yes, Alex, as you were asking the question, the thing that occurs to me is what Xavier needs is to aspire to be solid. I mean, that should be his goal. I got to be solid. If he is solid, everything else flows from that. The spectacular will come because he's dynamic. He's a great ball handler. He's an on and off shooter, but he'll make some big shots. But it's got to start with solid, and that's on and off the court, obviously, with him. He's got to be someone who understands that if I am a rock solid person, we are going to be special. And that is not, that is very much in reach for him. There have been a number of players at that position over the past 20, 25 years while I've been covering the game nationally for Sporting News that I could point to and say that player grew up between his sophomore, junior year, or in this case, junior to senior year, that player grew up and started to understand, like, this is the last shot I get. And so what do I need to do? And I'm sure he's hearing that he needs to be solid, a solid citizen, a solid teammate, and to an extent, because the ball's in his hands, he may not be the loudest voice. I don't know for sure. I would imagine after some of the things I've heard from Trace that he's the loudest voice, and he should be. But when you have the ball in your hands, you're a leader. So he's got to be those things. And if he is those things, it just raises IU's ceiling that much more. And to be honest with you, it's not that hard to achieve. I think sometimes players shy away from it because if you're expected to be dependable, then people rely on you. And some players aren't comfortable being relied upon. You have to grow into that. You have to grow into understanding that sometimes people are going to look at you and say, we need you. We need you to take us through this. It's not easy to win high major Division I college basketball games, especially in a league like the Big Ten has been. But if he embraces that, it really, even more so than all the things he can do to get by people, to create things, to get into the defense, to take the ball away from opponents, all that stuff is great. And it will happen if he starts with, I got to be there for my teammates every time I'm on the floor and every time we're together off it.
Two quick things before we get you out of here. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the transfer portal and whether it's, obviously this now been a couple of years in. I kind of call it the free agency period for college basketball because the season ends. It seems like all these guys go in the portal. It's every day. It's the verbal commits. Twitter account is tweeting, this guy's in the portal. This guy's committing here. So it's kind of like, it's not as obviously followed as NBA free agency, but it's a hot period for college basketball. I think in terms of interest in the game, I think maybe it's prolonged the season a little bit afterwards and kept people engaged. Just curious what your thoughts are on that. And then NIL a year in, is it been a net positive overall for college sports?
I don't think there's any question about NIL being a net positive from the young athletes getting access to money that they wouldn't have had before. And not having to worry about, look, they were never, a college athlete on a college, when it went on a college campus, never was really hurting for food. But and after there was some controversy about that at the 2014 tournament, I mean, they just like opened the refrigerator and said, have whatever. So at that point, it was never a problem. So it was really more about, things they wanted to do socially, things they wanted to be, can you put gas in your car? There were times when athletes did have those issues. And now it may or may not be universal at the high major level. I suspect it is, that everybody's going to get something. And maybe even dipping down below that. I talked to a Columbia football player this summer who I met doing a media thing. And he had an NIL deal. So So I think that's been great for the athletes. Terrific. And I'm really excited about that and happy for that. And it's also helped retain athletes, which is one of the reasons I was surprised by some of the moves that players like Caleb Houston and Moussa Diabate made. Max Christie at Michigan State, was that they don't have to do that now to get money. They can be judicious about when they enter the league. You look at Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky, he's getting, the word is $2 million to stay in college. Again, NBA not necessarily yanking on him to bring him into the league. Here in Division I basketball, he can get maybe $2 million. It's a great choice. So it deepens the competition and makes it better for those of us who consume it. As far as the transfer deal, the 1 year exception, the 1 year eligibility, immediate eligibility, I was always skeptical of that, Alex, and not so much because of rampant team changing, but more so because of how it affects the athletes. When it was a year in residence, for the athlete, it was time to develop, because obviously something wasn't happening at their previous school. I mean, we don't see a ton of guys who are, averaging 25 points a game or whatever, that are wanting to go. So it's usually a player who needed some adjustment, some improvement. And we get a chance to see that improvement happen during that year. And then they come out and they're ready to go. And even more important, academically, it's almost universal. When you transfer, you lose credits. And when you transfer and retain that year of eligibility, you get a chance to catch up or get ahead. For a time, it was almost impossible you almost had to try not to graduate if you were a transfer athlete in Division I and completed your athletic eligibility. You really almost had to try not to graduate. So that was really good. And now I don't think we're going to have this problem in the short term because of the COVID year. Players are staying so much longer in this window. That'll cycle out, I think, in 2 years. I think we'll be out of players that will have the COVID year available to them. And if immediate eligibility is still a thing, and I think it will be, that's when we're going to start to see athletes graduate at a lower pace than they've been for the last 10, 12 years. That's a disappointment. And I think it's not necessarily good for the young people to move and lose those credits and never quite be able to catch up and wind up perhaps leaving college without a degree and maybe not returning to finish.
You can read his work at the Sporting News, and we'll look forward to his return. I'm assuming this winter on the Big Ten Network for college basketball. Always good to talk to you, Mike. Thanks for joining the show this week.
It was a real pleasure, Alex. Thank you.
If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.